And welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Claire Nazir. Today we're asking, what does an earlier onset of the season of spring in the UK mean for wildlife, plants and trees, and the delicate web of nature's timings that holds it all together? Spring. It's the season we wait for. The first birdsong before dawn, the snowdrops pushing through, that unmistakable warmth of the sun. But spring in the UK is no longer what it used to be. There's a lot of scientific research on spring's increasingly earlier arrival time by observing patterns in nature. Timing is everything, from swallows crossing the Sahara on their northward journey to bluebells carpeting local woodlands. Many species are being forced to adapt, sometimes in ways that put them and others at risk. In this episode, you'll be hearing from Grahame Madge, Senior Press Officer at the Met Office, and a man who has spent over 50 years watching birds. Before joining the Met Office, Grahame spent more than 15 years at the RSPB, and he's a trustee of the marine wildlife charity Marine Life. He's also one of the UK's most experienced communicators on the intersection of climate science and the natural world. And today he'll be talking to Alex about what our shifting springs mean for the wildlife in the UK. Grahame and Alex draw on a number of scientific studies, including the Met Office State of the UK Climate Report 2024, which tracks the changing timing of frog spawn and blackbird nesting. Also, some fascinating research using 6 decades of Bewick swan migration data and fresh analysis of first swallow sightings and the orange tip butterfly. Full references in the show notes. Now here's Alex Burkle talking to Grahame Madge.
Grahame, thank you so much for joining me on Climate Conversations. I've really been desperate to have a chat with you because you have a huge knowledge and passion for birds, don't you? And where did this first start? When did you first take an interest in birds?
So when we moved to Devon as a family, I was about 8 years old. We moved to a house with quite a big garden.
Nice.
There were lots of birds there, but also not far away, within 300-400 yards, there was the Tor estuary. So I used to go watching birds on the Tor estuary, and that was really what got my passion going. And I can't really remember a time that I've not been interested in birds and wildlife. So it's a great hobby because there's always birds around wherever you go, whatever time of year. But you do have sometimes a disconcerting habit of looking out of windows when you're talking to people. And birders say they can always spot another birder because they're the ones looking out the window and not paying attention to what's going on in the room.
So I won't take it personally if you start looking away from me and start ignoring me. That's fine, that's fine. Now, do you have a particular favourite, maybe one that you've spotted that you are most proud of?
So, a few months ago, I found a bird in Britain that was only the 10th ever sighting. So if you keep score, this would be a career highlight.
Yeah, so the 10th sighting of this bird in Britain?
In Britain.
Oh, wow.
So,
ever?
Yeah, and it was the first for 20 years, I think.
Oh my gosh.
So it was a bird called a lesser crested tern. It's a type of seabird. And it was on the Exe estuary. Quite an easy bird to identify. There was no particular skill on my part in seeing it and finding it. I just happened to be the first observer that spotted it. But it was a career highlight, and I'm probably never, ever going to find anything as rare again. And in the world of birding, for about 2 months, I was a minor celebrity. So not A-list, but I was a minor celebrity.
Because then everyone else wanted to try and find or trying to see this bird?
I was getting messages from birders all over the country, desperate to know if the bird was still here and whether they should risk a journey to come down and see it. So birding can be a little bit mad sometimes and obsessive.
Did people come down to see it?
Yes, in droves.
And they spotted it as well?
Yes, there were special boat trips laid on for birdwatchers to go and see it.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, it lasted for about 10 days, so I try and be as generous as possible, so it was nice and comforting that, I got to see something special, but my sighting meant that lots of other people were able to come and enjoy this particular bird as well. And that gave me a lot of satisfaction.
You must have been really excited when you first saw it and realised what you'd seen.
I was buzzing when I first saw it, but trying to convince people on the boat of what I'd seen, because didn't know the other people on the boat. There was about 50 other bird watchers, but fortunately I'd managed to get some pictures that were sharp, and showing the other passengers, they realised what we'd seen, released the news, and by the time we were going up the estuary, by the time we turned round and started coming back down, there were little groups of bird watchers lining the estuary, setting up telescopes in order to try and see this lesser crested tern, which, as I say, you know, is one of the rarest birds to be seen in Britain last year. So I'm immensely proud of that.
I bet, and that's all because your message got around and got out to people.
Yes, because I was able to share it.
Amazing.
So the marvels of modern communication, modern cameras, phones, you know, in days gone by, that message might not have got out and people might have missed it.
Interesting. Now, you're here to talk about birds, and you've been watching birds for over 50 years, really. And thinking back to your childhood and childhood springs in the 1970s, what felt different to what we have now?
So at the time, there were birds that you would expect to see, birds like Brent geese, black-tailed gobwits, pintail, all these birds which come in to the UK for the winter. And those were the birds that I used to see on the estuary when I was 8, 9 years old going out. But over time, our winters and spring have changed, and we've now got to a point where if you go bird watching in the places where I used to go as a boy, you will see birds that I would never have dreamt of seeing 50 years ago. So a good example of that, Alex, is a bird called the little egret. Mm-hmm. And it's a type of small white heron, and I see them wherever I go now. But I can remember back in the 1980s seeing my first little egret, and it was a real rarity. People would travel hundreds of miles in order to see a little egret. But with climate change and warmer winters, these birds spread up from the Mediterranean. A small white heron that you especially see in places like southern France and Spain, Portugal. But they've now colonised Britain, and they're one of our more common herons. You can see them literally everywhere. I've seen them in the parish where I live in Exeter.
I suppose it'd be interesting to, catch up in 10, 20 years' time and see if the tern that you spotted a few months ago, if that's becoming more common.
That might be pushing it a little bit, but we are seeing signs of other species beginning to colonise. So what you've got, Alex, is a general drift of birds coming in, not just birds, dragonflies and insects and all sorts of other species, but they're coming in at the south as our climate is warming. So a good guide is anything that occurs in northern France or had occurred in northern France 20, 30 years ago, could probably find a home in southern England if the habitat was here and if it was able to arrive. And we expect this to continue as our climate continues to warm, that we will get more species coming in the south. And you might think, well, that's no bad thing, Graham. You're seeing more birds. What's the problem? Mm-hmm. But what you have to remember is at the other end of the country, in Scotland and in the Cairngorm Plateau, which is the UK's really only Arctic outpost, we're losing birds and other wildlife from the top of Britain as the climate is no longer suitable for them.
The ones that prefer it colder.
The ones that prefer perhaps a more Arctic feel are the ones that we are potentially losing. So you're getting this drift. And when I worked at RSPB, the society did a study on birds and climate change, and the average distance that bird ranges would shift was about 550 miles. So if you think of the south coast of England and go 500 miles further south, you're well deep into middle and even southern France. So species that occur at that latitude, there is a good chance that some of them may eventually get to colonise Britain.
When you talk at that distance, how long does it take for them to get that far?
Depends on how successful they are. So it depends on their mobility, and it depends on whether the habitat requirements are available in areas where they need to move to. So for some species, the English Channel is a huge barrier. You can't imagine reptiles, for example, or amphibians making an easy crossing. But birds, butterflies, moths, dragonflies, they're all very mobile. And we are seeing lots of new species. So there's a species of dragonfly here, the small red-eyed damselfly, which occurs on our ponds outside the Met Office.
Yeah.
And 30 years ago, that species would have been extremely rare in Britain. But it's come here because of climate change, and it's able to spread. So we're seeing these things all of the time beginning to colonise. So yeah, the natural world is a good indicator of how climate change is having an effect. And by monitoring populations of birds and insects, we're beginning to see these changes, but also appreciate how quickly these changes are taking place.
Now, as you already mentioned, you worked for a time at the RSPB before coming to the Met Office. Now, was there a moment, was there a time, an instant that made you realise that there's the link between the climate story and birds' story?
So I started working for the RSPB in 1997, and climate change was a concept, and we were worried about how climate change would impact bird populations. But it was around 2003, 2004 when we first started to get a real wake-up call that climate change was affecting populations of birds, and I remember it very well. Along the eastern coast of the UK, there are lots of seabird colonies, and birds were struggling to find fish. Now, when seabirds are feeding their young, they like to take sand eels, fish about that long, full of protein, full of fat, very good chick food. And the sand eel population was beginning to crash because of a warming North Sea. And that was the first real indicator to me that climate change was happening. And I remember working with the environment correspondent at the time of The Independent. We managed to get this story on the front page of The Independent. And that was an indicator in itself that climate change was real, and that there was media, political, social interest in that story. And from that moment, I realised that climate change and trying to tackle it was one of the things that I should do. And then later, with the publication of other studies showing how much birds and other wildlife would be impacted, climate change is obviously one of the biggest threats that our wildlife faces. But wildlife and nature are having to cope with climate change at a very fast rate, faster than anything we've seen in the geological record. But we're expecting species to cope with that change at a time dealing with other things like invasion of non-native species, persecution of species, habitat change.
Of course.
And we're expecting it to deal with all of those challenges in one go.
And so no wonder that some species may be thriving, but many species are suffering and struggling as a result.
Absolutely. So there are some winners and some losers, and climate change will present some winners. One of the challenges with climate change is that some of the winners are likely to be pest species. So colleagues here at the Met Office are working on trying to model the distributions of things like Colorado beetle, which is an infamous pest of potato crops. There are a whole host of moths and other pest species on the other side of the channel, bark beetles, which could decimate forestry. So it's a really challenging time, and we're trying to monitor some of these species and model their distributions so that, you know, we have a handle on what can occur here and how we would tackle them.
Now, the UK Spring Index shows that spring biological events are happening around 9 days earlier than they were a century or so ago. And also the rate of advance is accelerating above 7 degrees. What effect is this having on birds that are migrating from sub-Saharan Africa, which rely on daylight cues as opposed to temperature cues to sway their pattern.
So what we have to remember here is that different birds will have different strategies for survival. So if you look at a bird of typical British woodland, let's take blue tit for example. So blue tits don't migrate, they stay here all year round, and they have coped for centuries with the challenges of the British winter. And their strategy is to sit tight, try and find food over winter, and sometimes when you get a hard winter, there will be a great deal of winter mortality, and then there will be fewer birds making it through to spring. That's their survival strategy. Other birds, let's take the swallow as an example, insectivorous bird. They travel here from South Africa in the summer. They nest in barns all over the UK and farms and outbuildings. And their strategy is when you get to autumn and the insects start to drop off, their strategy is to fly all the way south to find food. And that's quite an expensive strategy because they have to face and endure all of the challenges on migration. Mm-hmm. So coping with crossing the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean, the whole continent of Africa, because they go right to the southern tip of Africa. And it's a trade-off. Sometimes that gamble pays off. The birds that migrate, if they have a good migration, they will survive and come back next spring. But what we're seeing is with things like milder winters, for example, we're seeing those birds that take a gamble by staying here in the winter, they're able to, in a mild winter or early spring, actually start breeding and thinking about nesting much earlier. So they'll pair up, they'll form territories, and what is happening is those birds that still are tied to migration, they don't have that advantage anymore. So they come back to British woodlands and a lot of the territories are gone. Some of the food supply will be depleted because birds are already nesting and feeding their young, reducing the overall abundance of prey. So these gambles that the natural world take are shifting in a way which is against a lot of what migratory birds need.
And talking about migratory birds, the knock-on effect, different birds have reacted in different ways, haven't they? So you mentioned swallows. They're arriving a couple of days earlier than they used to, but swifts are actually arriving later, is that right?
That's true. So there's some evidence to support that. And as a bird watcher myself, I always used to think that around about the first, second week of April is when I would expect to see my first swallow. And now it's probably late if I don't see a swallow in March. It's, a trickle coming through, the advance party coming through. So there's been probably around a 10-day or more change in the arrival dates of some of these birds. But you're quite right, the evidence seems to support the fact that swifts, which winter in a different part of Africa and come back much later, swifts really come back in May in any number. And there do seem to be a mismatch with their arrival time. They've not quite caught up with the changes that we're seeing in the British countryside. So they do seem later. There's a lot more scientific work to try and unravel what is going on. And swifts are only a tenth of the population that we have of swallows, and they're facing other challenges. So there's a lot going on with swifts. But you're right, in some contexts, these mismatches are occurring in the natural world. You would expect everything to be moving and advancing at the same pace, but there are some winners and losers, and understanding that is key to understanding how our wildlife will change.
And going back to birds that stay here, talk about the blue tit and caterpillars, because peak caterpillar breeding season or peak caterpillar availability in UK woodlands has changed over the years. It's come about 20 days earlier.
Around 20 days for
since
some.
Since the 80s. What knock-on effect has that had on species like blue tits and pied flycatchers, which match their breeding season with the peak caterpillar availability?
So blue tits, for example, have one brood. They only have one clutch of eggs. And a year.
Okay.
And their natural behaviour is to time the hatching of their chicks with the peak emergence of caterpillars that you've just referred to. And those two cycles should go in sync so that at the time you've got lots of blue tits in the nest, young blue tits, you've actually got plenty of food in order for the parents to find and feed their young. So the danger is that these cycles, although they're all shifting, if they start to shift in slightly faster or slower cycles, then actually you start to get the mismatch in some of these timings, and then potentially you have a problem. So pied flycatchers, as you've mentioned, is a bird which winters in Africa and arrives in spring. I haven't seen one yet this year. I hope to go to Dartmoor and the woodlands on Dartmoor to see them fairly soon. But they're doing reasonably well. But birds like cuckoo, for example, which come back in late April, early May, are really struggling, and their numbers are crashing.
Is that because by the time they get here, the caterpillars are the things that they've already been gobbled up? And
again, there are many challenges, and conservation scientists have got a huge amount of work to do to try and work out exactly what is going on. But there have been lots of studies looking at birds like cuckoos, for example, to understand what is happening. But they do face real challenges along with many other birds. I mean, I remember as a boy being able to go out and watch birds called spotted flycatchers, beautiful little birds. But now I think they've declined by about 90-95% compared with when I was watching them back in the 70s and early 80s. They're still around, you can still find them, but they've become so thinly spread. Scientists are struggling to understand exactly why they're declining at such a huge rate.
now, you talking of birds that are declining at a huge rate, you spent some time at Slimbridge, where there are Bewick swans, and there's been a huge decline in the number of those over the decades, going from over 600 in the 70s to less than 100 in the winter just gone. How has that been tracked, and what does that tell us?
So I'm going to paint you a picture of Slimbridge because I don't think we're doing it justice.
Okay.
So for people that don't know, Slimbridge is a nature reserve on the edge of the River Severn in Gloucestershire. It was founded by Sir Peter Scott, a naturalist that many people will be aware of. And it's the winter home of birds called Bewick swans. And Bewick swans, these aren't the sort of swans that you feed the bread to in the park. These are really wild swans. They nest in Arctic Siberia, and in the winter, in order to escape the harsh conditions, they move southwest from Siberia all the way down to wetlands in the UK, and Slimbridge is a classic place to see them. But because our winters are getting milder, the energy that those birds use in order to get here, they're reluctant to use that energy in order to come here. So the numbers in winter have been dropping because these birds are performing a behaviour called short stopping. So rather than making that journey all the way from Siberia to the UK, they're short stopping in Holland, in Germany, even around the Baltic. So they're finding conditions there that enable them to survive without spending all that energy to come all the way another 500, 750 miles. And energy budgets for birds are really important. It's a matter of life and death. So they take a gamble that they will stay further northeast and don't need to travel. So we're seeing the UK population of Bewick swans in winter hemorrhage because I think last winter there was about 100 birds at Slimbridge spending the winter, and they would have had many times that in days gone by. Certainly Peter Scott would have seen many more birds per winter than we're seeing now. And
that's because they don't need to travel as far as they used to.
They don't need to travel as far as they used to.
So why would you?
Exactly. If you can find what you need 500 miles nearer to where you've nested, that makes good sense. So the global population of Bewick swans are declining. They are a species which are struggling, but the decline in the UK is particularly pronounced because they're just not arriving here in the numbers that they used to.
Now, moving on to marine life data, which surveys seabirds and dolphins from ships. What similarities are we seeing with life out at sea that compared to what we're seeing over the UK, for example?
So I have first-hand experience of this because I am a surveyor with marine life. So I go on boats, counting seabirds, dolphins, whales, whatever we see at sea. And we're noticing significant changes along the Channel coast. So species like basking shark are quite rare down in the southwest now.
Yeah.
They seem to be occurring some numbers further north, but they're quite scarce in the southwest. But we're seeing tuna coming in. Tuna, perhaps a more warm water species. We're seeing common dolphin spreading up into the Channel and even around the Straits of Dover and up into the North Sea, where we wouldn't have seen the numbers that we're recording now. But some other species, like white-beaked dolphin, which is a more northerly species, is now becoming quite rare along the Channel coast. So we're seeing and monitoring all these changes of bird populations and mammal populations by studying them from ferries and from other boats. But it gives an indication that, you know, climate change is not just affecting what's happening on land, it's also a part of the marine environment. And as you'll know as well as I do, Alex, that the UK has been subject to marine heat waves for quite a lot of the last 12 months. So temperatures of the marine environment a degree or so, or even more, above what they should be. That's fueled an octopus invasion that we saw last year, fishermen reporting huge numbers of octopus, taking lobster and other shellfish. And that has brought in other species. Risso's dolphins have come in. They're a specialist feeder on taking octopus and squid and other cuttlefish. So their numbers have been up. But it's just an indication that all the time we're seeing these changes happening really rapidly.
And it's always interesting when the idea of new species coming closer to the British Isles and being able to spot them. But we've always got to counter it with the concern and the risk of, like what you say about the impact it has on our native species and those kind of things. So do you have any major concerns on that side of things? Nature
is struggling at the moment. We're seeing some successes. We're even seeing whales, fin whales, coming back into the southwest. So I'm sure many people wouldn't realise that humpback whale and fin whale are part of our native British fauna. And you can now go to places in Cornwall and see them with some chance of success. So it's not all doom and gloom.
So
we're
they
seeing
moved
some
away?
Things. Their numbers were affected and depleted by whaling, by lack of food, fisheries taking a lot of fish, but our waters are now able to support species like these, and they're coming back in some number, giving us a lot of optimism that things can change for the good. But we are seeing other very dramatic changes. I liken it, Alex, to a carpet. If you imagine a patterned carpet that represents Britain's nature, and that carpet becomes threadbare and worn, and you can still just about make out the pattern of what you had, but there are holes appearing in it. That, to me, symbolises the state of our biodiversity. And what people are trying to do, organisations, is to put the pattern back into what we should have. But over time, we are seeing changes coming in as well as new species arrive. Ones that we would have had are ebbing away. So we're trying to deal and arrest the biodiversity crisis at a time when we've got climate change altering the baseline of what we should have here. So hugely challenging times for nature.
You've been on The One Show, you've been on Countryfile, you've been on the Today programme, reaching out to millions, talking about your expertise. What which part of it is most important? What do you think resonates most with your audience?
I think what resonates most is the fact that we are a nation of nature lovers. So trying to talk to people about climate change in abstract terms can be quite difficult.
Yeah.
But if you're talking to them about impacts that they can appreciate by looking out of their kitchen window when they're doing the washing up, you can begin to make people realise that things are changing, that nature's cycles are changing, we're getting plants coming out earlier, birds arriving earlier. So even with a relatively modest degree of climate change that we've seen so far, and in Britain we've seen about a 1.3 degree rise in the average temperature, even with that level of change, you're seeing very dramatic and profound changes in the natural world. And I think that captures people because this is something that they can see with their own eyes.
I think you're right, because it is very difficult as a climate communicator trying to get the story across, and people are very much like, and what? You know, unless you see it in your own back garden, which, as you point out, lots of people are. Now, if someone's going to go out now to their back garden, to their local park, what signs could they be looking out for to see the changes to our spring, the changes to our seasons in general?
So I'm sure people are seeing the earlier emergence of familiar butterflies like brimstone and speckled wood butterflies. They'll be noticing birds arriving earlier if they take notice and interest in these things. The changes are there for people to see. Gardeners will appreciate that some plants are coming out earlier. We ran on New Year's Day, we worked with the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and we did an analysis of their New Year plant hunt. This is where their volunteers go out and see what plants are in flower, daisies or ground ivy and all those other plants that come up. And the study shows that there are many more plants that are appearing around New Year's Day now compared with historically. Some of those are ones which have lingered over winter and have just made it through to New Year's Day and are still in bloom. Others are ones which are coming out effectively for the spring very early. But the number of plant species that you can see are changing. So all of these things are out there for people to be able to observe and understand.
Lots and lots of things for people to be on the lookout for. We've talked about the fact that some species are thriving and some species are struggling with our changing climate and other things that are changing around the world, around the UK. At what stage do you think it's our duty and worthwhile us stepping in and aiding these species? And at what point do we have to sit back and just let nature sort of take its course?
So I'm so glad that you've asked me that question, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about one of my favourite birds, the puffin.
Oh yeah.
So puffins are quite small seabirds. Puffin, if it was sat on my hand, would be about that big. They live on the island of Lundy, among other places, and Lundy is Old Norse for puffin. So
is it?
even the Vikings would have known Lunda as an island where you get puffins. So puffin numbers were declining on the island along with other seabirds, and there was a rather dramatic decision taken that puffins and Manx shearwaters and other seabirds needed to be protected because of invasive black rats which had got to the island. So they got there by ships, and they became resident on the island, and rats will adapt to any food source, so they will take young seabird chicks. Seabirds can only really nest on islands because they like to be away from ground predators. And remote islands are the best places for them to nest. But when you have non-native predators introduced, then populations of those seabirds, they can't cope and they start to go down very rapidly. So you asked me a question about whether we should interfere. And for me, a good example of where we should interfere is where culturally there has been centuries of connection with the certain species that you get on that island, puffin,
Yeah.
And I think society had a moral duty to intervene to remove rats from Lundy in order to give that island its character back. It was a controversial decision. Not everybody agreed with it, but rats have now been removed from Lundy, and it's now possible to see them thriving on the island. And every time I go, I always make a beeline for the puffin colonies.
Of course, yeah.
And it's great to see their numbers coming back. So yes, sometimes we have to intervene, but I think if mankind, not you and I, but mankind have created the problem, then I think we have a moral responsibility to put back the damage that or to make reparations for the damage that we've caused.
Graeme, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you on Climate Conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If today's conversation piqued your interest, you'll want to join us for part 2, when Alex sits down with BBC's Peter Gibbs, fellow meteorologist and Gardener's Question Time panellist, to take this story into the garden and the world of plants. For now, thank you to Grahame Madge for his conversation. From Alex and I, great to have your company, and we'll see you again soon.